Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima of economicsjunkie.com and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 24, Why Minsky Matters, part 4. Today we'll read once again out of Why Minsky Matters, and we're almost done with the book. So
we're almost done with the book. What are we going to read after this?
In case anyone's getting bored, you're going to be relieved pretty soon.
So, Nima, before we dive into the book, can you give us an idea of what we're about to get hit with? Because
we're going to talk about Minsky's views on financial reform and how to change the system to promote stability, democracy, security, and equality.
So we're going to have the answer, right?
The answer.
This is like the answer to fix stuff.
The answer, yeah. Technically,
so I mean that's worth getting excited about. We're going to be talking about the answer to fix stuff. So, right. Let's take it away from point 1. Go for it.
So we left off in Chapter 7, Financial Reform, last time, and there was something that I wanted to focus on real quick. So, and I quote, "What Minsky had developed from the early 1970s could be called dynamic macroprudential of a dynamic, evolving set of financial institutions and relations. Effective regulation must be reassessed frequently and made consistent with evolving market and financial structures." And here's a quote directly from his book. "Over time, the initially apt pattern of regulation and supervision becomes increasingly inept. The inherited structure of regulation and the supervision first becomes not quite right and later becomes perverse. A cumulative effect of the institutional and usage changes that occur is that the institutions, which are supposed to contain the endogenous disequilibrating forces of our economy, lose much of their power to do so."
Can you translate that into English?
The institutions that are supposed to regulate our financial system are going to become less and less effective, to the point where they become perverse, in fact, and they not only prevent bad stuff from happening, but they aid in bringing about bad outcomes.
This almost sounds exactly like what we talked about from Carroll Quigley in The Evolution of Civilizations, where the instrument eventually becomes an institution, right?
Exactly.
So when we have a regulatory system that's supposedly set up to fix certain things, at first it may actually fix those certain things, but eventually both the regulators and the people who are trying to dance around the regulation, whether or not they get in cahoots or whether or not they just one starts to outsmart the other and the other one just gets old and decrepit and dumb. However the specifics of it works out, eventually you're going to get into the situation where the regulators are now aiding the new problem.
Yeah, and the regulators, their regulatory position helps them attain prestige and power and wealth. And so they start promoting their own agendas and their own well-being over the actual objectives that they were created to achieve.
And is Minsky arguing, sorry if I'm reading ahead here, that there's no way around this?
Well, Minsky says that there's no way around the banking system innovating their way around the regulations all the time. So he has, and we've discussed this also in our previous shows about this book, he's strictly against having one fixed set of rules, because that'll just become outdated, and in the end it'll just be the exact opposite of what was intended, because the banking sector will work around that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely makes sense.
Right. So In other words, the regulators and supervisors need to have their fingers on the pulse of the entire financial system, not just the regulated banks, but also the largely unregulated shadow banking system. And regulations must evolve along with financial practices. But how could the central bank closely follow developments in the shadow banking sector? After all, it almost completely missed what was going on in the home mortgage securitization business through 2006. Minsky believed that because a central bank needs to have business, supervisory, and examination relations with banks and markets if it is to be knowledgeable about what is happening, reducing its responsibility for examining and supervising banks would inhibit its ability to perform its monetary policy function. And that's basically, if you understand how the private banking system works, the so-called private banking system, the so-called private banks are just an extension of the Fed in the end. And they get reserves from the Fed.
They have to own stock in the Fed. They have to have a line of credit from the Fed. They have to have essentially permission from the Fed / the government to do everything that they're doing.
And the Fed takes care of all their interbank clearing, etc. So Minsky just argues that, if that's, he's coming from the perspective that, well, if that's who they are and that's the relationship between the Fed and the banks, then it would make more sense to let the supposed regulator actually regulate the banks.
Right, because if the banks are essentially a government organization, why let them run amok?
Yeah, exactly. Well, what you want to regulate the military? What are you, crazy? Some crazy libertarian? It would be the same argument, right? So, moving on to the three fundamental faults of capitalism. Keynes's general theory from 1936 identified two fundamental flaws of the capitalist system: chronic unemployment and excessive inequality. The two are linked. Excessive inequality puts too much of the income into the hands of the rich, who prefer high rates of saving rather than spending. That depresses demand and keeps jobs scarce. And there's a side note here that I wanted to read. It is a bit more complicated than this, because if the rich saved in the form of productive capital, machines and factories, that would create jobs. The problem is that they prefer to save in liquid, money, broadly defined form, which does not create jobs. As Keynes put it, unemployment results because men want the moon. In explanation, money. Is that what IE stands for in explanation? I don't know. IE, money. Minsky added a third. Instability is a normal feature of modern capitalism, which is a financial system. Furthermore, persistent stability cannot be achieved, even with apt policy, because it changes behavior in ways that make it, a depression, and debt deflation likely. As Minsky put it, one can read almost all of the textbooks and most of the current journal literature without being made aware that the overriding issue in monetary economics is whether capitalism is flawed in that it is inherently subject to booms and busts. However, this was clearly the concern of Keynes and the Chicago School of the 1930s. Although it is true that other interpreters of Keynes emphasize that economies can experience downturns, even severe ones, almost all of them see these as deviations from equilibrium brought on a variety of shocks to the system. Or, to put it another way, they presume that the capitalist system is naturally stable. When it moves away from equilibrium, government can use monetary and fiscal policy to push it back.
Can we talk about equilibrium a little bit?
Yes.
Because I stumbled upon this when I was poking around some economic stuff. And again, I'm not the economics junkie here. Nima is. So when I'm poking around, I'm literally poking around. I'm not reading the stacks and stacks of economics books that Nima seems to mow his way through on a regular basis. But one of the things I bumped into was this concept of equilibrium. That there's this state that the economy tries to float toward, and there's things that push us out of it, and I believe the Austrian or the libertarian side would say it's government intervention that pushes us away from that equilibrium. And if we could just stop the forces that are pushing us out of equilibrium and let it get back into that equilibrium, everybody will be just fine.
Right.
Everybody will be just fine. And this is kind of a holdover, I think, from the invisible hand of Adam Smith. And I also think this idea is pervasive erroneously in other subjects, particularly ecology. There's the same argument with ecology that the world is supposed to be in equilibrium, that there's this perfect equilibrium that nature's supposed to be in, and humans push it out of that. Humans screw it up, and if humans could just stop screwing it up, everything would just go back to happy equilibrium. However, there's no evidence that actually happens in nature, just like there's no evidence that this actually happens in economics. So,
except the Club of Rome says mankind is the enemy.
Right.
Never forget that. Right.
So there's this again. It's like there's all these different academic subjects where often when you look at like the fundamental premise, and for example, equilibrium being one of these fundamental premises, you can see that that's not accurate, and you can say, okay, how is anything that you're creating based off of this fundamental premise remotely accurate?
Yeah, and this equilibrium idea also goes back to the barter theory of money in a way, because the idea is that everything started with barter. People start exchanging goods freely. Prices are, at any point in time, they're just a perfect expression of scarcity and supply and demand, and everything is allocated efficiently that way. But in reality, the monetary economy didn't occur like that, or didn't evolve like that. But it came as a top-down imposed system. Prices are top-down imposed, and government taxation causes liquidity preference and scarcity of liquidity.
Government taxation provides liquidity preference. You mean I need to have some cash on hand in order to pay my taxes when they're demanded?
Exactly.
Okay.
So the government taxation creates the monetary system, and the government taxation is the reason why people hold on to liquidity. The government taxation is the reason why a worthless piece of paper suddenly has money, value. Suddenly has value.
We got you.
And so it's from the top down, from start to finish. It's not just, it's plausible that this non-free market system is prone to shocks and instabilities for several reasons, mostly because the amount of taxation changes all the time, the amount of money made available to the private sector by the public sector changes. So this is constantly, it's like a cycle that's constantly tweaked and meddled with from above.
Well, and then because he brought up those 3 points, which were chronic unemployment and excessive inequality and instability. And I think that the instability is very interesting, particularly when we compare it to what we were just talking about, the equilibrium, where, again, a lot of economists assume that instability is a result of the government poking the wrong things, or the oligarchic class poking the wrong things within the economy and screwing everything up. When in reality, as you just said, it's the basis that the money system is based on this top-down price structure where money is forcibly introduced and it's forcibly extracted. Prices are determined initially by the government because when they create the money, they buy something with it, and that's your first price. And then markets, after they get a hold of that, are able to go around and have this in quotes, free market system. But in reality, there's this baked instability into the system where the free market is, how do I want to say it? It's kind of at odds against how the system is built.
Yeah, frankly, it's also been a method of colonialism. It's been a method of taking over tribal societies. It's what the British did in South Africa and all over Africa, in fact, as far as I'm aware, where they would just impose a tax. And so now suddenly everyone living in those little hut villages who didn't know who the British were to begin with or what they wanted, they suddenly needed to pay a tax or they would be kicked out of their homes. It's a lot of these domination systems are very legalistic in how they dominate the people that they dominate. So they really make it look very legit and legitimate. And, you know, well, you owe the tax, you owe the money, so you don't pay, you get kicked out of your home. And that's how it works. And that's how it's always worked. And that's where the system came from. Not from some people exchanging some pliers and some chicken feet.
You say chicken feet or chicken feed?
Feet. This was a Chinese experiment. Example. Okay. So, moving on. Minsky argued... No, wait, that's... Oh. Was it the right one? Yeah. Minsky argued that the situation is precisely the reverse. In the system is fundamentally unstable, but instability can be constrained by apt use of fiscal and monetary policy. However, this is no simple matter. First, there's uncertainty over the effectiveness of policy. More importantly, adopting a policy is likely to change behavior. And to the degree that policy actually constrains instability, it is more certain to induce behavior changes that will make the stabilizing policy less effective. Stability is destabilizing! Exclamation mark.
Explore that idea. You've explored it here before, but explore it again. Why is stability destabilizing?
Because stability makes improves our perceived ability profits. And
it improves our perceived ability to do what? I'm sorry, there was a little bleep.
To predict future profits.
Got it.
And to plan for future profits. And so if you're more certain about the future, you allow for less of a safety margin in your estimations and all your day-to-day dealings. And when you allow for less of a safety margin, then that means that your financial position becomes speculative. So Minsky goes through three stages of riskiness in financial positions. The first one is hedge, where all your future profits will pay for your interest and your principal payments, and you'll have some left over beyond that. That's a hedge financial position. A speculative,
the fiscally conservative position, right?
Yeah. The speculative position is the one where your profits are enough to cover interest and principal, but nothing beyond that. And
that's, so that's essentially zeroing out. You're paying all the bills, but you're not making any money.
Right.
Okay.
And then the final one is the Ponzi position, which is the one where your profits are not sufficient to make monthly payments. So actually you become more in debt over time as you make your payments. And so if the future outlook is better and better, then we become more and more reckless in our behavior. Long story short, become more reckless, then we become more susceptible to some sort of crash, and that won't be good for the economy.
And then we become more stable because we crashed and we zip back and we get all conservative about our money again.
Exactly, become stable, and then people start saving more again, and so on and so forth. So, after his stabilizing book was published in 1986, Minsky argued that the relative stability of the post-war period had led to development of money manager capitalism, a much more unstable version of the 57 varieties of capitalism. He calls it 57 varieties of capitalism. Probably a joke about Heinz ketchup or the pickles or whatever it is.
Can you explain the joke? It went over my head, which means it probably went over some of the people listening's heads as well.
Heinz Ketchup has a number 57 on it, or something like that, and 57 is the number of different kinds of whatever, I don't know. Anyway, after a stabilizing book was published in 1986, Minsky argued that the relative stability of the post-war period had led to development of money manager capitalism, a much more unstable version of the 57 varieties of capitalism. In a prescient piece written in 1987, Minsky had predicted the explosion of home mortgage securitization that eventually led to the financial meltdown in 2007. Indeed, he was one of the few commentators who understood the true potential of securitization. In principle, all mortgages, as well as many other kinds of assets, could be packaged into a variety of risk classes with differential pricing to cover risk. As he put it in that piece, that which can be securitized will be securitized.
So,
Minsky argued.
Can I interrupt really quickly? I got two pieces here
Sure.
that I'd like some clarity on. So, money manager capitalism. I take it he's making a joke with that 57 forms of capitalism.
Yeah.
What exactly is money manager capitalism?
To understand this, we probably need to talk about the different stages that Minsky assigned to the different developments of capitalism throughout the past centuries.
Hit it again.
So Minsky talks about different stages of capitalism throughout the 18th and 19th and 20th, or I guess maybe 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. And if I remember correctly, the first stage is commercial capitalism, which was mostly around trading and goods. There wasn't really much industry yet. And then the next stage was industrial capitalism, which is when sort of small businesses, etc., would use profits to finance capital expansion projects and machinery build and stuff like that. And then those projects became larger and larger so that it couldn't be financed out of the company's own profits anymore, but they had to be financed by big pools of money, which would be supplied by investment bankers who specialized in pooling together large pools of money. And then stage became financial capitalism, where the majority of money was being made just by manipulating or predicting the prices of claims to future profits.
So we really get into speculation at that point.
Yeah. And then thereafter, we entered after the Great Depression, and this kind of capitalism led to the Great Depression, 1929. Then after that came a lot of reforms that restricted the banking system and sort of a couple of other social reforms, etc. So I think Minsky calls that the paternalistic welfare state capitalism.
Glass-Steagall being one of those forms, correct?
What was it?
Glass-Steagall was one of those reforms, correct?
Siegel was one example, but it was not, according to Minsky, not even a very important one. Mm-hmm. But lots of other reforms were made around that time. And the system became pretty stable. So going back to Minsky's hypothesis, no major financial crises occurred for quite a while. You had a couple of recessions here and there, but the system became stable. But as it became more stable, it also became more reckless, and the financial sector would work around regulations, etc. And big pools of money would start offering money market funds, hedge funds, and university endowments, pension funds had a lot of decision-making power in the direction of corporate strategy, etc. Just because they began owning a lot of corporate shares.
So, and
that's
what was the post-crash or the post-war capitalism called again?
Paternalistic welfare state capitalism, I believe.
Paternalistic welfare state capitalism. Got it.
But it was just more a system that's kind of that recognizes MMT, you could almost say, because if it wasn't about austerity, it was about using the government deficit to prevent recessions, depressions, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And public works programs, a lot of programs that got the U.S. sort of out of the depression in the 30s. They were sort of under this form of capitalism. And that, because it was so stable, morphed into what's now, according to Minsky, called money manager capitalism. So that's sort of
and this is
the
where
long answer to your question.
And the money manager is what you were just talking about before I interrupted you, which is these big pension fund holders or university endowments or whatever else is on the list that you just said.
Pension funds, big pension funds, mutual money market funds, and university endowments.
So essentially, this
maybe actually, I would also add foundations probably to that.
Yeah. So
Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundation.
So these foundations or these different, it's a new class of manager that has incredible control over so much money that they're quasi banks, right? These are the shadow banks he's talking about. Do I have that right? Exactly. And they're different from actual banks in the sense that they're not regulated as banks are. They're not creating money out of nothing like banks are. They just have so much money that's already been created. They have the how do you want to say it? The muscle to do what banks traditionally did.
Right.
Okay.
More reckless, so they could make bigger short-term profits by circumventing regulations that applied to banks. And then the banks got jealous, and then the banks went crying to the government and asked for the same rules. So their rules were loosened, and so the system became more unstable over time. To the point where we had liar loans and people getting 50 zillion mortgages left and right for nothing. Exactly. So, going back to what we're reading here, Minsky argued that securitization reflects two developments. First, it is part and parcel of the globalization of finance, because securitization creates financial paper that is freed from national boundaries. German investors with no direct access to America's homeowners could buy a slice of the action in the booming U.S. real estate markets. As Minsky was fond of pointing out, the unparalleled post-World War II depression-free expansion in the developed world, and even in much of the developing world, created a global glut of managed money seeking returns. Packaged securities with risk weightings assigned by respected rating agencies were appealing for global investors trying to achieve the desired proportion of dollar-denominated assets. It would be no surprise to Minsky to find out that the value of securitized American mortgages at the peak in 2007 exceeded the value of the market for federal government debt, nor that the U.S. mortgage problems quickly spread around the world after mid-2007. You see, that's why we talked about this the other day. The private debt was so high in the country at the peak of the mortgage crisis. It was about 3 times income. And this also corroborates that here. The amount of mortgage debt was larger than the federal government's debt. That's nuts. From a German bank, IKB, that required a bailout in July of that year to problems in BNP Paribas, France's biggest bank, to run on Northern Rock in the United Kingdom. The second development assessed by Minsky is the relative decline of the importance of banks, narrowly defined as financial institutions that accept deposits and make loans, in favor of markets, quote unquote. The bank share of all financial assets fell from around 50% in the 1950s to around 25% in the 1990s. Okay, so the other things are money market mutual funds, shares of corporations, etc. So you see that it's possible here to observe how the bank lending type of financing has been crowded out by the
new money
common
manager
stock type of financing and other shadow bank types of financing.
Well, and then
the global casino needed fuel.
Hold on a second.
And it was the movement away from...
Interrupt here. So, and the important part of that is that when we're sliding from 50% of financial assets being controlled by the actual banking system, and when we say the actual banking system, this is banks defined by the government, and they're beholden to certain rules, and they're FDIC insured, and blah, 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 blah. 50% of total assets goes to 25%. So the control over the total assets by percentage of, total assets gets cut in half, which, when you say, okay, so banks lost half the control, so what? No, it's not that the banks lost half the control. That means the amount of regulation that's supposed to be protecting the situation lost half of its control. Right? Am I extracting the important part out of this? So what would normally the government would be able to regulate and say, okay, don't do these certain things or else things are going to go crazy. They lost half of that control.
Yeah.
Okay.
The global casino needed fuel, and it was the movement away from traditional banking to the originate-to-distribute model that opened the floodgates to risky mortgage products to serve as the basis for speculative bets. So those are sort of the two developments that Minsky describes here, that led to securitization, essentially.
And can you define securitization for me?
Yeah, securitization means to sell ownership to a portion of an income stream. Basically, to create tradable paper out of income streams.
Can you give me an example?
I'm a home lender and I make interest income of a mortgage. Now, I just make that mortgage into security and sell it to someone else, and they're entitled to that income stream.
Got it. Okay.
And that's basically sort of... And another trend, of course, securitization, which we covered earlier in this book, another reason, or maybe it just goes hand in hand with this here, which is the idea that the money supply causes inflation, so we have to reduce credit-induced money. We have to limit the amount of money created through credit in the economy and money created otherwise. That's all monetarism says, basically. That way, were put in place to make it harder on regular banks to lend, but the shadow banks would just take that business and do the same thing,
right? Without any of the regulatory without any of the regulatory requirements that the normal banks have. And
when they lost money, they wanted to have the same regulatory requirements,
right? Because
they wanted the bailouts,
right? We're not FDIC insured, but can you do it to us after we lost everybody's money?
Hindsight, exactly.
So what's the solution here? What's Minsky's recommendation to fix this shit? Are we there yet?
conclusion, so I'm just skipping ahead here. Minsky argued that there are two main ways in which the capital development of the economy can be ill done: the Smithian and the Keynesian. The first refers to what might be called misallocation. The wrong investments are financed. The second refers to an insufficiency of investment, which leads to a level of aggregate demand that is too low to promote high employment, and with insufficient productive capacity to promote living standard improvements. By the way, the Smithian is also, in a way, you could almost say the Austrian perspective is also in that direction. And he's not just saying that either are wrong. He's saying that both have some merit.
Which one? Say what the Smithian means again.
Is that a misallocation occurs, so that the wrong investments are financed.
Okay.
From both, but most importantly, from inappropriate investment, especially in excessive commercial real estate investment. We could say that the 2000s, again, suffered from Smithian ill-done capital development because far too much finance flowed into the residential real estate sector. In both cases, Minsky would point his finger at securitization. In the 1980s, because the thrifts were not holding mortgages, they securitized them instead, they had funding capacity that flowed into commercial real estate, in that case REITs. Real estate and investment trusts were part of the problem. In the 2000s, the mania for risky, high-return, asset-backed securities fueled subprime and Alt-A lending. At the same time, we faced unemployment that is chronically too high, even in the bubble-fueled booms. As a result, aggregate demand is chronically too low, only exacerbated by rising inequality that puts too much of the nation's income in the hands of the rich, who save rather than spending. Hence, in designing reform, we face both the Smithian problem and the Keynesian problem. We first deal with the Keynesian problem that financial institutions might not provide the right amount of finance. Then we turn to the Smithian problem of allocating the right amount of finance to the activities that actually promote capital development. Opening the discount window to provide an elastic supply of reserves ensures that banks can finance positions in as many assets as they desire, borrowing at the central bank's target rate. This method does not ensure that we have solved the Keynesian problem, because banks might finance too much or too little activity to achieve full employment while promoting the capital development in the economy. It is somewhat easier to resolve the too much part of the Keynesian problem, because the central bank or other responsible bank regulators can impose constraints on bank purchases of assets when it becomes apparent that they're financing too much activity. For example, in the past U.S. real estate boom, it was obvious, except apparently to mainstream economists and many at the Fed, that lending should be curtailed. The Fed had the authority to do so, but refused to intervene. And the orthodox response to too much lending is to raise the Fed's target rate. And because borrowing is not very interest rate sensitive, especially in a euphoric boom, rates must rise sharply to have much effect. Furthermore, raising rates conflicts with the Fed's goal of maintaining financial stability, because, as the Volcker experiment from '79 showed, interest rate hikes that are sufficiently large to kill a boom also are large enough to cause severe financial disruption. Approximately 3/4 of all thrifts were driven to insolvency. There's no real smooth relationship between higher rates and reduction of loan demand. When rates get sufficiently high to induce insolvency, defaults finally snowball through the economy, causing panic and collapse of spending. So we've talked about that many times before. And it's just nice to see that repeated once more.
Right.
That the interest rate has no effect on bank lending, really. And maybe only at a very high rate where it completely messes with your economy.
Yeah, where it's so expensive. It's just like, I mean, we already make loans now at super low interest rates where you end up paying more interest than principal by the time you end up paying it, and that's already at like 5.3%. Man, once you get like to 18,
exactly,
what is going on? Like that's some crazy stuff. But like he was saying, it gets euphoric, and you get into the situation where you don't care what the interest rate is. Just get me into the house.
Yeah, exactly.
People get into that mindset.
Estimated a comprehensive programs cost about 1.25% of national output. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. So this Minsky's agenda for reform.
We're getting to it.
And this the transition job, or some call it job guarantee program, to various New Deal employment programs, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Youth Administration, as examples to guide creation of a comprehensive employer of last resort program, arguing that only government can offer an infinitely elastic demand for labor, which is necessary for full employment. Minsky estimated a comprehensive program's cost at about 1.25% of national output, which is in line with more recent estimates of others promoting such programs. Experience in Argentina and India. In addition, Minsky would offer a universal child allowance, also equal to about 1.25% of GDP. Together, these programs would replace most welfare and unemployment compensation spending, providing more opportunity and dignity for participants than current programs do. Okay, so I don't think we need a child allowance program, but
maybe only to
the employer of last resort program.
I just wanted to throw that in there, where if we're going to have a child allowance, make it only for married couples.
Oh yeah,
but that's a different topic entirely. Please continue.
% of GDP for a job guarantee. I mean, we've talked about that so many times. All the problems that would solve and all the hardships that it would preempt or prevent or cure, it would be, I mean, you could have a ridiculously small government with this kind of program, which is very libertarian.
Well, and then
in my opinion,
it's the natural component. If you have a monetary system where you demand a tax and you got to spend the money into existence, you have to have a method of people getting that money. And if the current method isn't in any way equitable, right? I mean, we live in a society that has this constitution about everybody has equal rights. And we don't want to jump over into socialism where we say, okay, everybody deserves an equal amount of stuff. However, we should have an equal opportunity to go for that stuff. And because we're in a top-down system where the money, the direction where the money comes from and goes to is very, very, very politically oriented. It's not like, oh, we all have equal access to this money. We don't. So to aim at the very, very bottom with this federal transition job, which says, okay, we're the employer of last resort, and we are going to make sure that there's a method of ejecting private sector net savings to the lowest stratum of society. I think that's the natural component to the system, like the way that the system is set up.
Right. As I just read, these programs would replace most welfare and unemployment compensation. So that's good. And he argued that his programs would be less inflationary. Unlike welfare, which pays people not to work and thereby increases demand for output without increasing supply, a jobs program would be geared to produce useful output as well as to enhance productivity. This is because some of the jobs would be focused on promoting the capital development of the economy, discussed above. This development includes public infrastructure. Furthermore, keeping people employed and providing training on the job would improve human capacity. Minsky also anticipated the objection that full employment must be inflationary by proposing a relatively fixed and uniform program wage that would actually help to stabilize wages by providing an anchor. All of these arguments have been taken up in recent years by advocates of employer of last resort policies. Finally, he would reduce barriers to labor force participation by eliminating the payroll tax and by allowing retirees to work without losing Social Security benefits. He would have endorsed President Obama's payroll tax holiday that reduced taxes on all workers by 2 percentage points. Unfortunately, the holiday ended when the compromises with the compromise the president made with Republicans in the fiscal cliff negotiations of early 2013. So, thanks, Republicans, by the way. Minsky would have gone further by eliminating the payroll tax on both workers and their employers. He could not see a public purpose in discouraging work, and especially by doing so with a regressive tax. Taxes designed to hit low and middle income earners hardest because of the cap. Wages above a certain level are not taxed, and non-wage income is not taxed at all. However, the other component of his proposal actually has been followed, as Social Security recipients have been able to continue to work with more of their earnings exempt from taxes. That's your payroll tax elimination that he proposes right there.
Yeah, well, and then I just have to agree with him over and over and over again. The idea that of all the things that you could tax, whether it's property tax or sales tax or whatever, the idea that you're going to tax people specifically on the payroll is so ludicrous. Well, like he said, all it's doing is it's punishing anybody who wants to work. Whether they're working for whether they're working for a big corporation, a small corporation, whether they're working for themselves, it punishes everybody equally. And if you want to hear a small business owner bitch to like crazy, ask him about hiring employees. He just pulls his hair out going, it's so complicated and it's so expensive and the government sticks such a huge probe up your ass, I don't do it. It's not worth it. And how many jobs is that killing? I mean, I know we were just talking about the federal transition job, but how badly is the economy getting neutered simply from the fact that it would employ itself if it could, but it's just this barrier is just so big.
They just giant corporation, and then they'll go easy on you.
Yeah, it cut out a little bit. A what corporation?
A giant corporation with lots of lobbying power.
Yes, that.
And then they'll go easy on you. Minsky argued that free market ideology is dangerous, particularly at this stage of capitalism. Ironically, the invisible hand could not do too much damage in the early post-war period, given the low level of private debt, with private portfolios full of government debt, and with memories of the great crash of '29 generating conservative behavior. However, now, with private debt ratios much higher, and after decades of leveraging in an environment that promoted greed over fear, the invisible hand promoted increasingly risky behavior. Thus, Minsky's alternative policy proposals in the 90s were designed to reduce insecurity, promote stability, and encourage democracy. He continued to support job creation, policy to promote greater equality of wages, and child allowances.
So there's a federal job, there's a federal transition job, and have we gotten to the point where he recommends what to do with reform of the financial sector?
Past that, I think.
We passed it?
Yeah, that was the last chapter, financial reform. A lot of it is so basically making the so-called private banks go to the Fed for lending at the discount window, in other words. And that way the Federal Reserve Bank can have a look at their books and assess their riskiness.
Right.
Improving underwriting in general.
I remember that now. Sorry, I want to repeat it just so everybody can understand this. Is that right now, when banks need reserves, they typically go on the interbank lending market to get them. What Minsky's saying is eliminate that interbank lending market and require them to go to the Fed so the Fed can see what's going on. Do I have that right?
Yeah, applying them with reserve. Yeah, the Fed is supplying them with reserves in the end, anyways. But currently, they're just blindly pulling reserves out of and pushing reserves into the market.
Got it. Without any idea what it's for.
Right. I'm just going back. That was the last chapter that we read, and a couple of those items we covered on our last show about this. But generally, it's improving underwriting and examining banks at the discount window, and that's pretty much sort of what he recommends as far as financial reform goes. So, where was I? Okay. So we have...
And then Nima, just to remind you, is there a little bit left, or is there a decent chunk left? Because we're pushing a good amount of time here. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah. Downsizing finance to address unemployment, inequality, and insecurity. Finally, returning to Minsky's views on unemployment, poverty, inequality, and insecurity, he certainly would be appalled at recent financial sector trends. First, there has been an important shift from the wage share and towards gross capital income, that is profit share. Many have argued that stagnant wages played a role in promoting growth of household indebtedness over the past 3 decades, with rapid acceleration since the mid-1990s. As many at the Levi Institute have been arguing since Minsky's death in 1996, the shift to a private sector deficit that was unprecedentedly large and persistent would prove to be unsustainable. The mountains of debts, the net private savings that we talk about all the time, the mountains of debt still crushing households is in part caused by the shift of national income away from wages as households try to maintain living standards. That shift largely benefited Wall Street's 1%, right? Because people went to the banks to borrow. And I don't know if we covered this on our last show, but actually maybe I just tweeted it out completely unrelated to our last shows, but austerity reduces the income injected into the private sector and makes the private sector more dependent on borrowing from banks.
Which is, in quotes, the private sector. So the private sector goes into debt with itself. Essentially.
So the banks are kind of like a public-private institution, so you could argue one way or the other. But they go in debt that they have to repay, is the bottom line. And that makes them more dependent on banks, that improves bank interest income, etc. So it's kind of like almost like a government subsidy to the banking system to promote austerity, is what I sometimes think. But anyway, reading about this one here. According to a study by Pavlina Cherneva, 95% of the benefits of the recovery from the global financial crisis have gone to the top 1% of the income distribution. Another study finds that the top 1,000th of the U.S. population now owns a fifth of all wealth.
There you go.
Yay.
That's where it should be.
Equally problematic is the allocation of profits towards the financial sector. Just before the crisis, the finance, insurance, and real estate, or FIRE sector, got 40% of all corporate profits, and its share has returned to that level. This was written in, 2010 or something.
Mm-hmm.
This level contrasts with a 10 to 15% share until the 1970s and a 20% share until the 90s. Whereas value added by the FIRE sector also grew from about 12% in the early post-war period to almost 20% today, its share of profits was twice as high as its share of value added by the time of the bubble in the 2000s. So, what was I just saying? Was I just saying that austerity is a little bit of a
subsidy
benefit to the banks? And then you see here 40% of all corporate profits go to the banking and insurance sector. So that seems to be working out well. Okay, now just another. In the early post-war period, depression ensured cautious use of debt. But as the period over which the economy did well began to lengthen, margins of safety and indebtedness decreased, and the system evolved towards a greater reliance on debt relative to internal finance, as well as toward the use of debt to acquire existing assets. As a result, the once robust financial system became increasingly fragile. And then we're just reading the conclusion, and then we're finally done, so you can breathe a sigh of relief. Conclusion. Over the past decades, the belief that markets work to promote the public interest gained popularity. Minsky questioned, but what if they don't? Then a system of constraints and interventions can work better. He wanted to develop institutional ceilings and floors to help constrain the natural inherent instability of the modern economy. He also believed that we need to make industry dominate over speculation, recalling Keynes's famous dichotomy, and not vice versa. Or the capital development of the economy will be ill done in two ways: the Smithian neoclassical way or the Keynes aggregate demand way. If investment is misdirected, the Smithian problem, we not only waste resources, but we also get boom and bust. If investment is too low, the Keynesian conundrum, we not only suffer from unemployment, but also profits are too low to support payment commitments, leading to default. Furthermore, when profits are low in industry, then problems arise in the financial sector, because commitments of that sector cannot be met either. In that case, individual profit-seeking behavior leads to incoherent results, as financial markets, labor markets, and goods markets all react in a manner that causes wages and prices to fall, generating debt deflation. The Smithian ideal is that debt deflations are not endogenous, rather they must result from exogenous factors, including black swans with fat tails, but also because of too much government regulation and intervention. So the solution is said to be deregulation, downsizing government tax cuts, and making markets more flexible so that they can respond quickly to shocks like unexpected black swan events. The Minskyan view is that the financial structure is transformed over a run of good times from a robust to a fragile structure as a result of the natural reaction of agents to the successful operation of the economy. If policymakers understood this, they could formulate policy to attenuate the transformation and then to deal with the crisis when it occurs. Relying on the Smithian ideal is, for Minsky, nothing more than believing in invisible hand waves. Minsky acknowledged that pessimism permeates his approach. Stability is destabilizing. There is no final solution to the problem of instability. However, Minsky was fundamentally optimistic in his outlook. We can do better than we have done so far. Woo!
Holy shit.
That was it.
We done did it. So, give me a summary and conclusion here, Nima.
I just literally read the conclusion for you.
You give me your summary and conclusion. Which is essentially, I mean, we've said it a couple times now, which is the federal transition job is, I mean, to call it vitally important, I feel like is an understatement. Underwriting standards are just, I don't know how to overemphasize the importance of underwriting standards, because those are really the gate which opens the money in the private sector, right? Which is, if you pass underwriting standards, money gets created. If you don't, it doesn't. So that's really the gatekeeper, not the interest rate. And like you said,
correct.
If the money keeps going to finance instead of going to industry, we're just going to continue fueling a speculative furor that doesn't necessarily generate anything other than giving more and more power to the people controlling finance.
Correct. Ongoing struggle for centuries between banking and industry, and the gold standard may be one example of that, because the gold standard enforces austerity, and austerity promotes banking over industry.
Right.
So
because deflation is good for the creditor.
And it's a policy imposed by banks. Austerity, gold standard. According to Carol Quigley, who was the Council on Foreign Relations historian, the banking lobby has always been the one pushing the gold standard. Market lobby or whatever.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah. That our incredibly enjoyable reading of Minsky's Randy Ray's Why Minsky Matters. This has been Amagi, hosted by myself, Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And we are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.